There's been a pretty significant uptick in Ukrainian offensive activity over the last few days. And as with everything around this offensive, official Ukrainian sources are pretty quiet. On the other hand, Russian media, both official and unofficial, have been blasting out information nonstop. What we've seen is sort of a slow build across three areas, with increased fighting at Bakhmut, Vuhledar, and Tokmat, and today there might be a fourth, with reports coming out about an attack at Avdiivka. Now, what's clear at this point is that Ukraine has suffered losses, both in terms of men and equipment, something that Russian media has been pretty quick to confirm with both videos and images. What's not yet clear is how much of the force that Ukraine set aside for just this purpose has been committed to the fight, or their casualty rate, or what the overall objectives of this operation are. To take a look at what's played out so far, there are a handful of pro-Russian military bloggers who are consolidating information from the front. Now, that's only going to give us one side of the story, but throughout this conflict, these unofficial media sources have proven to be quite a bit more reliable than official Russian channels. And again, we just don't have much to go off of from the Ukrainian side. Of note, most of these mill bloggers were pretty alarmist in the lead up to the offensive, always thinking that the littlest attack or artillery barrage was the start of something big. And historically, they've been pretty quick to call out problems at Russian positions long before the Ministry of Defense. Even some of the more pessimistic voices like Igor Girkin are pretty consistent in saying that the fighting is intense, but for the most part, Russian defensive lines have held. War Gonzo, one of these pro-Russian military bloggers, reported that what elements in the Zaporozhye region are seeing is essentially reconnaissance by combat. He said that the Ukrainian goal there doesn't appear to be finding a weak point in the line, but rather a weak point in the Russian supply lines. And where return fire runs low or out of ammunition is where Ukraine focuses their attack. I think that ends up being the same thing from the attacker's perspective. It was just interesting that Russia called these out separately. I mean, from the view of Ukraine moving towards the line, an area where fire stops or slows becomes a weak point. I don't think it matters so much if it's due to lack of weapon systems, poorly trained soldiers, or supply deficiencies. It's a weak point to be exploited. This same soldier mentioned through War Gonzo that they hadn't yet seen any Leopards or Bradleys, which is very specific to his little sector of the fight because they most certainly were used in other areas, adding that he doesn't think this is the full offensive, but just the beginning. Igor Girkin then put out a long post a few days ago with his thoughts on the offensive, saying that he believes it kicked off 5 to 6 days ago with the focus at Orikhiv headed to Melitopol. He added that the attacks resulted in substantial Ukrainian casualties with limited results, except in areas he referred to as the gray zone. This is sort of how Russia plans their defense. As we've gone over in past videos here, the first line is usually just infantry fighting positions, foxholes, and relatively light weapon systems. So when facing an armored attack, that line's only real hope of holding are the minefields along with artillery and air support. So if Ukraine is able to advance that first line of defenses, the Russian troops then fall back to the second line, which could be 3 to 5 kilometers to the rear. Then from this second line with concrete fortifications, a more extensive trench network, and quite a few more anti-tank guns, ATGMs, and heavy machine guns, the intensity of the defense picks up. And this appears to be what some of the initially reported breakthroughs may have been referencing. If you recall, right out the gate, there were reports from a few areas of the front of Ukrainian success with Russian troops being pushed out of their positions. Then later that day, additional reports that Russia had retaken that same territory. So to me, that reads as though the initial line was breached and the attack was then stopped at this second line of defense. Girkin added that Russian air power, helicopters specifically, were more willing to push closer to the line of contact and played a major role in stopping these attacks. Then he finished by saying that he thinks this is just the beginning and anticipates this level of intensity could last from a few more days up to 3 weeks. Overall, Girkin comes across a lot more confident in the Russian situation right now than he has in a long time. Last one here from the Russian side is Dmitry Rogozin, a former deputy prime minister who is supposedly somewhat near the front lines with a group of military advisors. He said, quote, "I do not share the joyful reports about the defeat of the enemy. Yes, well done. But the enemy has not yet introduced the main forces of the breakthrough," end quote. And then there has been a little bit coming out of the U.S., just nobody going on record. A CNN report from yesterday quoted a U.S. official as saying the losses are significant and Ukrainian forces were met with greater than expected resistance in the opening days of the operation. So if I had to summarize the thoughts on these pro-Russian channels coming from soldiers at the front, it would be that the fighting was and is intense. The Ukrainian attacks have largely been stopped, but the end is not yet in sight. Now, while it's still early and there's a lot unknown, there are a handful of items with this Ukrainian offensive that stood out and are worth discussing. First, the location and style of at least some of these attacks was pretty surprising. If you remember back a few months ago, Russian naval infantry got chewed up pretty bad at Vuhledar. Ukraine released some drone footage showing Russian tanks and other armored vehicles driving across heavily mined open terrain in daylight while under artillery and ATGM fire. They were almost entirely wiped out. But that appears to be exactly what Ukraine did here, which in turn produced pretty similar results. From the images and videos I've seen, it looks like Ukrainian armored columns moved out in daylight across heavily mined fields, and Russian artillery and aviation were able to inflict pretty significant damage. I didn't expect to see that. The second item here is that the time and effort that Russia put into building these defensive positions appears to have been worthwhile. This really all started when General Surovikin took over last fall, and rather than continuing the attack in multiple areas, they started digging in. At the time, Russia and Surovikin caught some flack, and this defensive mentality is rumored to have been part of the reason that he didn't stay in that position for long. But these last few days have shown that he might have had the right idea. One of the major benefits Ukraine has had in this war is that they've been on the defense, and while there's no hard and fast rule that defenders always win or always suffer fewer casualties, it's pretty safe to say that the defense is easier than the offense. It's just a lot easier to hold a position and fire pre-planned targets than it is to advance under fire. And it's not close. So far in this war, Ukraine has conducted offensive operations, but this is their first time going up against reinforced Russian positions. I mean, some of these areas they've been attacking have been built up for 6 to 8 months now. During that time, Russia was able to dig these trenches deeper, add more overhead cover, lay out a crazy number of mines along with anti-tank and wire obstacles, set up pre-planned artillery targets, and build a supply system specifically designed to keep these positions in the fight. That's very different than what Ukraine faced in Kharkiv or Kherson last fall. This doesn't mean the fortifications can't be overcome, but for a newly trained Ukrainian force to brush aside a defense in depth in just 1 to 2 days with minimal losses is not a realistic expectation. So at this point, just a few days into the much anticipated Ukrainian offensive, what conclusions can be drawn? Not many, to be honest. The fact of the matter is the fog of war is thick and we're still operating with a lot of unknowns. It's very hard to extrapolate out from what we've seen just in the last few days as to what that means going forward. For one, while there doesn't appear to be any major Ukrainian breakthrough, the attack is just beginning. This isn't comparable to something like D-Day in World War II when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. In that case, the Allies put everything they had into a successful beach assault on June 6th. They were so committed that if they failed, it could be months at the very least before they could attempt something of that scale again. This is a very different battlefield. If Ukraine isn't successful in one area, they can attack elsewhere or regroup and try to hit that spot again. Of course, the element of surprise is reduced, but the lack of a breakthrough on day 1, 2, or 3 is not indicative of how the overall operation will play out. With how much attention this offensive has gotten over the last few months, really from both sides, it's understandable that folks want a clear answer as to its success or failure as soon as possible. But bottom line, it's going to be a while. Even looking across quite a few pro-Russian channels, the general mood is that this is far from over and there's a lot of tough fighting ahead. But that's all I got for now. Be sure to check out the Substack SitReps, where I put out regular updates on all sorts of national security topics. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.